Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Bill Clifford, President and CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America. I'm delighted to bring you this special program, this Zoom webinar, where our featured guest is Nancy Lindborg, President and CEO of the United States Institute of Peace here in Washington, D.C. Before I introduce Nancy, I want to just make a few introductory remarks and welcome all of you. We have more than 300 registrants from around the country, including about a third of that audience being high school students. This program comes about first and foremost because one of WACA's unfortunate happenstances this spring was that we were unable to produce our Academic WorldQuest High School Competition Championship. And over the past 5 years, by the way, Nancy has led USIP for 5 years. Over the past 5 years, we've partnered with this wonderful organization, most successfully in the recent 3 years, where they have hosted receptions and for 2019, the national competition itself. This year, we were unable to meet in person because of this horrible pandemic that is gripping our world. But we are delighted to hold this special program in its place, and we've expanded it beyond our student audience to World Affairs Council's members and the public nationwide. I want to dedicate today's program, which will be recorded, to the more than 357,000 people around the world who have died. US itself surpassed that awful milestone of 100,000 deaths yesterday. And there are nearly 6 million COVID-19 cases in the world as I speak to you. We are going to talk about today the impact of COVID on the world, how conflict interacts with the crisis, whether it impedes things or whether it is being intensified by the pandemic. And there's no better person than to provide information on this subject than Nancy Lindborg. Nancy, as I mentioned, has been serving as the head of USIP for the past 5 or so years. She joined in February 2015. For those of you not familiar, USIP was created by Congress in 1984, that's 3.5 decades ago, as an independent, nonpartisan, federally funded institute to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict around the world. USIP links research, policy, training, and direct action with partners in conflict-afflicted areas. Prior to joining USIP, Nancy served at USAID and the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. There she managed 600 team members in 9 offices focused on crisis prevention, response, recovery, and transition. She was involved in handling some of the biggest crises of those 4 years in Syria, droughts in Northern and Eastern Africa, the Arab Spring, as well as the Ebola crisis. Most of her career has been working on these humanitarian and conflict-related issues, and prior to USAID, she was president of Mercy Corps for 14 years, strengthening that organization into the globally respected NGO that it is. Nancy's lived in Nepal, in Central Asia, and elsewhere in the world. She has just been a model leader for USIP and for anybody in the NGO world. And Nancy, again, for the years of collaboration with your great team, Allison Sturma and Ann-Louise Colgan, who've been working with my team, Liz and Rachel, for these years. I can't thank you enough for all you've done for World Affairs Councils. I know you've visited several of them, and it's just great to have you here to have your expertise for today's program. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. It is really wonderful to be here today. Thank you, Bill, for that quite warm introduction and for the dedication. And I especially commend the World Affairs Council of America for pivoting your annual event to this format and carrying on. We have long valued our partnership with WACA, and I've had, as you mentioned, the great pleasure of visiting chapters from Alaska to Tennessee and North Carolina, as have many of my USIP colleagues. So if any members of those chapters are with us today, Pat, LJ, Lisa, warm greetings to everybody, and thanks again for hospitality and very energetic discussions. As you mentioned, we were very proud to be a co-sponsor of the Academic WorldQuest again this year. We were looking forward to hosting the national competition at our iconic headquarters building on the National Mall. We will look forward to next year in person. And that's great that we have members of the Academic WorldQuest audience tuning in. Please do ask a question, and I want to acknowledge and congratulate all of you. I hope all of you are very proud of your accomplishments in the local competitions. And I want to especially salute your commitment to international engagement, because that commitment is more important than ever. As Bill mentioned, we are traveling together through a terrible global crisis with profound and confusing implications now into the future here in the US and around the world. So the WACA networks, the friends, the colleagues, the events, and these discussions are absolutely vital as we together try to make sense of a world in flux and chart a better future. I think all of us are feeling the uncertainty, which seems a watchword of this crisis. There's a lot we don't know about this virus, a lot of changing information every day. But I want to talk today about a few things that are certain. And the first is that, Bill, you noted the terrible milestone of 100,000 deaths here in the United States. Without question, the pandemic has taken a terrible toll here. So it's difficult to look beyond our own tragedy. But COVID presents a very distinct and even more devastating threat to the less resilient, more fragile, and conflict-affected countries that are home to 1.8 billion people. This matters to them. It also matters for us, for our health and our well-being. Secondly, this will not be the last pandemic or global crisis to affect us. We live in a more globally connected world than ever before. So it is vital that we have the effective means for solving these issues that threaten all of us. We have many of the tools and the strategies. We need to refurbish and reinvent others and imagine many more. Third, every crisis presents opportunities for momentous and necessary change. Peace can emerge from pandemics, but only with concerted commitment, vision, and innovation. And in fact, USIP was itself a product of the great crisis of World War II. It was the brainchild of a senator from Hawaii, Spark Matsunaga, who returned from the battlefields of World War II, determined that the United States needed to deepen its commitment to resolving conflict without violence. So he persevered over many years. He had to carefully cultivate his congressional allies. Ultimately, a grassroots campaign was also part of turning that vision into reality. But 35 years later, USIP is here with a mission to embody American commitment to peace. And as Bill, you said, to work with partners around the world to prevent and resolve conflict. And we work not just with governments, but also with civil society, women, youth, activists, because we know that peace, sustainable peace, is built both from the top down and from the bottom up. So I want to dive into my first certainty. We work extensively in fragile states. These are places where the social compact between a government and its people have broken down. Places like Sudan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, they are characterized by deeply fragmented societies, mistrust of governments, and overuse of repressive security forces. And USIP works in these places because we know that fragile states are the common denominator of many of the threats to global peace. Civil wars, violent extremism, they produce the most refugees, they experience the highest levels of hunger and poverty. They are the most vulnerable to and the least prepared for natural disasters, climate change, and yes, pandemics. And you know, Bill mentioned my work at USAID. I got a very firsthand look at the distinct ways that disease can impact fragile states in 2014 when I was leading the USAID Ebola task force, spent time in West Africa, and I was left with 3 indelible lessons. The first is that a government's ability to contain the spread of a virus depends largely on whether leaders have the trust of their citizens. In Liberia, for example, the government was saying all the right things, issuing all the right guidance. They told people not to touch the sick or dead bodies of loved ones, not to eat bushmeat, which is how the virus was spreading. But years of bloody civil war meant that the citizens did not trust the information. Many of them, in fact, thought that Ebola was a ruse by the government to get financial aid. In the end, it required finding the trusted messengers people did believe, in this case, tribal leaders and faith leaders, but it underscored the precious commodity that trust is in a society. The second lesson is that heavy-handed security responses can hamper efforts to contain the spread as well as spark additional violence. And in Liberia, we saw the effort by the government to quarantine people in the capital city of Monrovia's West Point slum. It did so with physical barricades. It trapped tens of thousands of people inside, and violence broke out with a teenager killed as the armed forces struggled to contain the unrest. People didn't know why this was happening. They didn't trust the government, and the response of the security forces further exacerbated that sense of mistrust. Third lesson is that it takes global cooperation. It took a broad range of international partners to contain and defeat viruses that do not respect international borders. Ebola was harder to transmit than the coronavirus, but it is a ghastly more deadlier virus. And as we began to see cases leak into Europe and even the United States, it was clear this was a global problem. You may remember that utter sense of panic in 2014 that started to sweep through the US when just the first cases emerged on our shores. So the whole world needed to mobilize, and it did. The US took the lead in Liberia, Britain in Sierra Leone, and France in Guinea. There was a massive influx of resources and aid personnel into these three countries where Ebola was spreading. It was a shared strategy and a shared commitment, and it worked. Ebola never materialized in the rest of the world the way that COVID has. So we're just beginning to reopen our economies here in the US and Europe, but the number of cases are just starting to be higher and higher in fragile states. A lack of testing makes it very difficult to quantify the severity of the spread, and some of the countries may in fact be deliberately trying to hide how many cases. But what we know is that fragile states, when COVID comes, are ill-equipped to handle the battering ram of this virus. Not just the health impacts, but those second-order impacts of economic, security, and political upheaval. We see, for example, in Libya, the foreign medics have all fled, collapsed health system. In Venezuela, 30% of their hospitals lack power and water. 80% lack basic supplies. Sudan, a country of 44 million people, has only 80 ventilators and 200 intensive care beds. Refugee camps to slums across capital cities, people lack access to water and proper sanitation, so they can't do the basic prevention. The economic fallout of COVID is far greater in fragile states. They very much rely on informal economies, which are collapsing. Remittances are disappearing. Supply chains are already being interrupted, and chronic malnutrition is quickly pushing people into the brink of famine. And I recently spoke with a young woman from Yemen who said, death from coronavirus is possible, but death from hunger is certain. I think really sadly, COVID is threatening to reverse a decade of progress that we've had in the fight against extreme poverty. And in just a matter of months, the pandemic could push anywhere from 50 million to 500 million people back into extreme poverty. And these states, these fragile states, those are the characteristics that we saw in West Africa during Ebola. Poor health systems, lack of citizen trust in their government, weak governments reflexively turning to heavy-handed security efforts, and a poor response can inflame an already fragile society that's filled with grievance and inequality. Or, as we're also seeing, the pandemic can cement control of authoritarian regimes. So this leads me to my second point. There are, in fact, new ideas and strategies that we can use to get ahead of crises in fragile states. And these three lessons, the importance of good governance and citizen trust, the need for a security sector that can serve instead of repress, and a strong, well-coordinated international cooperation. These are increasingly accepted as the critical ingredients for preventing the chronic violence and crisis that constantly erupts in the fragile world, whether it's like a pandemic like COVID-19 or another terrorist attack like 9/11. And these lessons have increasingly informed a growing consensus over the last few years across international donors, including the US, that we need to think dramatically differently if we want to get ahead of crises. And in fact, in December of last year, US Congress passed the Global Fragility Act, a bipartisan, bicameral bill that promised to put these ideas into action. It put a focus on preventing violence by addressing the root causes of state fragility. It recognized that we cannot do this job alone. And the act calls on the US to work more coherently across the federal government, as well as with our partners overseas. It mirrors new strategies adopted by other international partners, including the UK, Germany, the World Bank, even a coalition of fragile states themselves. So we now have the opportunity to put these new strategies into place and to ensure that as we rush to respond, that we don't overlook them, that we employ them to enable more resilient states to emerge from this crisis. Which leads me to my final point, that it would be terrible to waste this crisis, because we know that big, momentous events like this crisis break open old, hardened patterns. It catalyzes innovation. And like all crises, this pandemic may have added new cracks to the ceiling, but it's also turned on a light switch. It's exposed to all of us the deeply embedded cracks that were already there. And we're all remembering, re-remembering and learning about the 1918 flu pandemic that we had forgotten. But it was that pandemic that revolutionized public health systems. And we all know that World War II gave birth to the United Nations, and it established an international order that has kept peace for 70 years. I would note also the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami paved the way for a peace deal that concluded 3 decades of conflict between Aceh and Indonesia. In 2011, USIP published a book called Pandemics and Peace, which offers a number of examples of countries overcoming conflict and differences to work together to prevent and respond to airborne disease. So we're only a few months into COVID-19. We have not yet seen the levels of partnership and cooperation that can help us overcome this crisis. But we certainly hope that the already strained international system for problem solving will get the overhaul that it needs rather than being discarded entirely. And I would say at USIP, we know that peace is not only the work of international institutions, governments, and world leaders alone. As I said earlier, peace is built both from the top down and the bottom up. And it takes the commitment, energy, and innovation from every level of society. So even as we look at this terrible tragedy, I am deeply inspired by the upwelling of the human spirit and the generosity of that spirit all around the world, even in tough places. In Venezuela, where 1/3 of the population faces food insecurity, doctors and nurses are being arrested. Activists are using WhatsApp to organize humanitarian responses. And in Tunisia, our youth partners have mobilized to hand out masks and hand sanitizers to security forces, which is not only a smart public health move, but it also builds trust between citizens and the police. And in Afghanistan, wonderfully, women and youth activists have sewn and handed out thousands of masks with the word peace written on the front. So we're seeing this outpouring of creativity, and I'm sure every one of you has seen that in your life as well. And I was especially heartened to hear that Twitter created a new gratitude emoji after seeing a dramatic number of tweets that express gratitude and appreciation over the last 2 months. So in closing, I just want to note that this pandemic may have required us to isolate from each other physically, but it's also underscored and revealed how vital connection and community are to our well-being. This is true for individuals, for communities, and for nations. So as we look ahead, there may be a temptation for the United States to retreat inward and to take another step back from the world stage, to retreat from the role that we historically have played as leaders in democracy and champions for peace and international cooperation. But as the past has underscored, and as I'm certain the future will remind us, we cannot survive this or any future crisis in isolation. Overcoming the worst of this pandemic will require the best of us, our humanity, our courage, our creativity, and our commitment to working together. We know every day at USIP, we know that peace is possible, but it takes action and it takes all of us. So my hope is that when we look back on the pandemic years, that we will be able to say that the coronavirus pandemic was not a cause for future conflict, but it catalyzed this new flowering of cooperation. It enabled peace. It came up with new ideas and new forms for making that happen. And this is the opportunity before us, and it's up to each of us as to whether we seize it. Thank you.
Nancy, thank you very much for those wonderful remarks. This is an incredibly challenging time, and you've managed to present also what is positive or potentially positive here. I want to just suggest to the listeners that and the viewers that in fact you can participate by sending questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And also for those who are accessing this program by YouTube, you can also communicate questions and my staff will feed those to me to hand on to Nancy. If you are a student, please indicate that. We want to encourage student participation because I mentioned at the top of the program initially, the United States Institute of Peace and Nancy, we're going to address our Academic WorldQuest cohort, but now it's a bigger group, but we want to hear from students and we encourage that. Nancy, I'm going to speak for the next 10 minutes, I guess, with you and kick off a little bit of a dialogue before we open it up. So I hope our viewers will be gathering their thoughts to present questions to you as well. And I already see the Q&A box lighting up below. So to start, let's pick up on one of the things you mentioned. For the last 70 years, the United States has been a crucial player, perhaps the player in the international system. We've organized and led through several institutions and organizations. What's different about this? You alluded to the possibility of America turning inward. What are the costs if we do so? What is happening at the international organization level to combat this crisis?
Well, I think, as I alluded to in my comments, there have been stresses and strains in the international system for some time. This is nothing new. And I love Secretary Madeleine Albright's quote that anything that's 70 years old could probably use a facelift. So we know that there is a need to reimagine, to refurbish parts of how we create an effective, inclusive system for solving international problems. But you can't just chuck it out without having something there to ensure that that can still happen. We have not seen the level of international cooperation, I think, that's necessary to really address effectively this pandemic. Part of that is because the major leaders of that international system have all been deeply preoccupied with their internal affairs, and understandably so. The US has been a global hotspot, and it's hard to look beyond our own shores. But as we begin to reopen, I think it will be absolutely vital that we start casting our attention around the world and understand what the long-term impacts will be in those most fragile states, and that our own health will depend on creating more secure health systems, less fragile states around the world. And we can't do that alone. And the genius of the Global Fragility Act, which got passed in December, is that it puts that into law. It says we absolutely need to do this with partners. You know, there are a lot of different systems. There's the UN, there are a lot of regional bodies. We've seen the shift in the UN over the years to be more inclusive of civil society, of, you know, bringing in other voices. We need to continue that. We need to continue to reimagine more agile, more inclusive, more horizontal organizations that can take us into the future.
Thank you for that. I want to drill down a little bit more on the organizational level. The World Health Organization internationally has come under some criticism, and this, I'm sure, was an important organization during the Ebola crisis as well, and other pandemics and health crises. And our own CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, has typically been the gold standard, the go-to organization in this country for combating public health emergencies. Now we're seeing both of these organizations come under some criticism. Can you draw on your experience in the Ebola crisis to assess the importance of these types of organizations, what they're doing now, to what extent the criticisms are justified, whether they come from the administration or outside it?
Well, let me start with the CDC. The US, through the CDC and USAID, had made substantial investments in the global health systems of some of the African countries, in particular, that surrounded these war-torn countries. So that as Ebola started to creep out of Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, the ability of Mali and Nigeria, Senegal, a little further, was critical in being able to stop the spread because of their capacities through the polio and other investments to do the contact tracing, the detection and tracing. And to have their own state level CDCs. That's just an absolutely vital function that we need to continue. And part of that was through the PEPFAR investment that, of course, the Bush administration inaugurated and has been continued. You know, I will note that during the Ebola crisis, the World Health Organization came under a lot of criticism because they were charged with having been captive to politics on the African continent that kept them from reporting the severity of the crisis earlier. As a result, there was a significant investment and a reorganization in their emergency response capacities. And I think that, you know, when we, the collective we, detect problems with these systems and organizations that we have developed over the years, that we do need to take seriously the criticism and seek to remedy it. And disruption can be good. It can disrupt the kind of old patterns that aren't serving us anymore. But we need to have those systems and those ways to enable international problem solving. It's absolutely vital. There's no future that I can envision where we can simply withdraw into our own country and combat these kinds of global problems.
You mentioned the Global Fragility Act that was passed by Congress at the end of last year. In other words, much of the work that got us to that legislation happened well before this pandemic. And USIP&U played a great role with a task force and advising members of Congress on what should be contained in that legislation. I wonder if you could share what was left out and what, now that we have the pandemic, is a glaring miss, if anything.
You know, I don't think there's no glaring miss that comes to my mind. And I think we actually don't know yet because we were virtually on the brink of being able to move forward with implementing these strategies. So what I worry about is that because it isn't tried and true, that we will miss the opportunity to, in fact, fast forward these ideas and strategies, which are actually a culmination of about a decade of hard-learned lessons, lots of evidence, lots of contributions from a multitude of actors. And what the Task Force on Extremism and Fragility was able to do, that you cited, the task force that USIP convened at the request of Congress, was to really consolidate a lot of those lessons, to put them in a framework that made sense to US policymakers and validate them. So we need to find out if we're missing something. And we, I think, have the urgent opportunity to put these ideas into practice. My concern is that, you know, in the rush of the crisis, you forget about new ideas. And this is exactly the time to be thinking with innovation and imagination.
Great. Well, that takes me to USIP specifically. Looking back on the 36 years of its existence and your 5+ years tenure, I wonder if this pandemic is the greatest challenge for the organization, and how you have looked at the permutations of COVID-19 around the world and reprioritize what your global team is doing, what kind of differences you're seeing at different regions of the world, what it means to steward the resources that you have to resolve conflict, to work with partners and governments to make a more peaceful world.
You know, USIP has shifted a number of times through its almost 36-year history as the world has changed. You know, it was born in the depth of the Cold War when everything was government to government, state to state. But over the past 2 decades, we have really prioritized working in those fragile states. And in fact, just a year ago, we inaugurated a new strategy that committed us to really working to help fragile states become more resilient, but also to look at the renewal of state-to-state competition, particularly great power competition, understand the need to re-energize international systems of problem solving, which are so critical to meet those threats. It's not just the pandemics, it's climate change, it's, you know, the pandemics of the future. And finally, acknowledging that in order to pursue our mission, we needed to be equipped to work in a rapidly changing, ever more complex world. We just didn't imagine that all of that would be put into fast forward and magnified to the degree that it is right now with this pandemic. But I think the fundamentals remain the case. We haven't shifted significantly what we're going to do, but we have had to look deeply at how we do it and how to continue to support, especially those working in tough environments, activists who, you know, last year was this momentous 2019 People Power Year, where we saw people rising up in authoritarian countries all around the world, holding their governments to account. And I think the issue that concerns me the most is the potential that they will lose momentum. So we need to find the modalities to help that not be the case.
Great. I have 2 more questions, and then I want to get to the growing list of questions that are coming by the Q&A function on the Zoom platform, as well as those that I'm seeing coming in from YouTube. And first goes to countries and regions. You laid out very well how some individual countries are grappling with failed healthcare systems and equipment, and I wonder if, you know, social distancing is even possible with migration and stuff and issues like this. But where in the world is the most critical, most problematic aspect of this crisis happening in your view?
That is a tough and terrible contest. But I would say that we are particularly worried about the Horn of Africa. This is a region that is food insecure in the best of times. And they are currently grappling not only with chronic malnutrition, but with drought. And on top of it, desert locust swarms. A number of those countries, Somalia, parts of Kenya, Ethiopia and Sudan are, have patches of their countries that are teetering on famine. And Sudan and Ethiopia are going through really historic transitions where, as I just mentioned, because of reformers, both top down, but especially bottom up, those countries have overthrown decades of repressive government and have the potential to move forward into more open, democratic, and resilient countries, but it's hanging in the balance. It's really hanging in the balance with the potential for, under the guise of quarantines or other measures, security forces could sweep back in and take control. So I'm really worried, and USIP is especially worried about that region, both because of the extraordinary impact on the health and the food and economic security of those regions, but also of the possibility of the lost potential of those two transitions. And it will take concerted effort, not just the humanitarian response, but also looking at the political and the security dimensions of this crisis with regional and international shared approaches and strategies. So it's really urgent that we think about these in those frames, or we will have, second and third order crises all over the world.
Great, thank you. And for my last question, I want to refer to 2 points that you made in your opening remarks. And one has to do with the kind of leadership, both top down and bottom up, necessary to attack this crisis and move beyond it. And secondly, you spoke of trust. We are in an environment around the world and in this country where science is taken less seriously, that there is mixed messaging going on through public health at a variety of levels. And I'm talking not just the US, but the US included, and disinformation. How can we do a better job of resolving the crisis and getting back to the next phase, whether it's normal or not, if we have this kind of dynamic going on where trust is diminishing between publics and leaders?
I think it's a very grave issue that we need to think about across the globe. And trust is the precious currency that enables governments and countries and communities to move through these kinds of crises. I'll just share with you that we are seeing extraordinary action by community and activist groups in really tough places, organizing to combat disinformation, to do Facebook campaigns or other kind of virtual campaigns to make sure that people do have access to more factual information about how to keep yourself and your family safe. Lots of countries, especially in the most fragile ones, information is being highly politicized and creating confusion. We're also seeing people organize to reach across divides. As I mentioned, the youth in southern Tunisia, for them they collected $1,000 to buy and distribute face masks and hand sanitizers to security forces. This is not a natural partnership, but it really built trust between the youth and the security forces in a way that has long-term benefits. And I want to note that there was a wonderful story last weekend that highlighted the fact that the countries that are doing the best in terms of moving out of this crisis effectively are the countries that are run by women. That's New Zealand, Germany, a couple others. And it's not women per se, and I'm not just making the case for women alone, but it's because those women leaders have a more inclusive style of leadership. So they have more voices at the table. It's the fundamental of inclusion that is one of the core principles of peace building. So they hear more views. They hear different views that allow a different kind of decision-making to happen and doesn't hold a leader captive to a particular view or voice. So I was
well said, and
very
certainly
pleased
so.
to see that.
Yes, thank you. I have a question from Emmanuel, who is a student, and he is very grateful for being able to participate here today. He'd like to draw you out a little more on how COVID-19 or pandemics in general could exacerbate intrastate conflicts. Intrastate.
Well, as I mentioned,
interstate too, but
yeah. Well, it can both be less effectively addressed in fragile states, but it can also exacerbate existing conflicts. We see where you have the repressive use of security forces in places like Kenya or India, where security forces are coming down hard on people. Maybe they're out after curfew, and that increases the distrust, or can create distrust between communities. It's also where you have a response that is unequal, and one group gets supplies or assistance over another group. You can exacerbate intercommunal conflict, which is a great danger. But as importantly, I think it also lays the seeds potentially for future conflict, especially if the response, or if international assistance with the response ends up cementing more authoritarian responses and more exclusive forms of government. And so that's what we all need to be alert for. And as we move out to try to create greater forms and more effective forms of assistance to these fragile states, those dynamics have to be at the forefront, not just the imperative and the worthy imperative of saving lives, but looking at how do you help these countries emerge with greater resilience, not cementing the fragmentation or the authoritarianism into place.
Here's another student question from Nathan Reichert, who goes to the trust issue. How will governments of fragile countries such as Sudan regain the trust of their publics?
Well, Sudan is a really interesting question. As I mentioned, they're going through this historic transition, and you've got a reform-minded government in place. They're being put to the big test right now. They need to demonstrate that they are acting in the interest of their citizens, and they are doing so equitably, that they're not favoring one group over another. And of course, this is a country with decades of history of intercommunal conflict. So it's going to be very hard, and you have a lot of regional pressures as well, which is why at USIP, we are making a full-throated call for attention and support from the international community to help that very fragile transition do exactly those actions to regain trust from their citizens. And there have been indications that the security and intelligence forces understand they need to act differently. And they understand that they need to serve the interests of the citizens, not control them for the interests of a corrupt regime. But these are changes that take a long time, and they're under a lot of duress right now.
Staying on the African continent, Joshua Boyle, a student, asks, will the current pandemic aid in the resolution of the Libyan conflict? Will Khalifa Haftar be more willing to come to the discussion table, or will he remain irreconcilably power hungry?
That is such a good question. If you go to our website, along with our board chair, Stephen Hadley, I put out a statement commending the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, for his tireless efforts to call for a global ceasefire. I mean, if there was ever an opportunity to grab out of crisis, it would be to have a global ceasefire. And initially, there were glimmers of hope that might happen. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that happen now. And Libya is the perfect example of a conflict that is both top down and bottom up, but also outside in, where because of all of the various stakeholders and external powers who are interfering in that conflict, it's very difficult for the Libyans themselves to solve this conflict. So this is an example of where there need to be third-party brokers who have at heart peace as the primary interest, that can, bring all the levers of international diplomacy and pressure to try to create within the external stakeholders an agreement to pull back, part of, and understand what are the causes of their disagreements. So there are multiple layers of deep diplomacy that will need to happen to solve that. And at the same time, I will note that at the community level, not very visible internationally, but there are extraordinary Libyans who are working to reach across divides at their community level and across various tribal divides. But that is an example. Libya is the perfect example where it will take a concerted, functioning, international problem-solving system to resolve that conflict.
Here's a question that could apply to many regions. It comes from Olinda Mabunda. What can peacemakers do to build a bridge between government and citizens, particularly minorities and immigrants?
Wonderful question. And this goes to the heart of what we spend a lot of time thinking and supporting, thinking about and supporting at USIP. And, I think it boils down to all the different ways that dialogue can occur. All the different ways where you can enable different groups, whether it's government and citizens or members of two different tribes or religious groups, to come together and have an opportunity to understand each other's concerns. What we see in the peace building world is the way that you become alienated from the other person, and that other person becomes difficult to still see as a human being with interests and concerns, lose compassion for each other. But we have a program that we call Justice and Security Dialogues, which in a number of countries, including Tunisia, as I've cited, we've brought together local citizens, often youth or women, along with security personnel, police officers. And they've been able to have the kind of dialogues that have completely changed their relationship and enabled entirely new forms of cooperation and understanding to emerge. In Nigeria, I visited a town where the youth had burned down the police station. They were so enraged with the treatment they felt that they were receiving. But after a series of dialogues, and it doesn't happen fast, but they reached such a level of understanding that the youth actually spearheaded the rebuilding of the police station. And it's created a different kind, ultimately it's understanding that the police are supposed to be there to serve the needs of the citizens. And often that gets lost in some of these places. So recreating that kind of understanding and can be a very, very powerful way of rebuilding trust.
Perhaps one more global question. It's anonymous, and that is, you've touched on the question of immigration and refugee resettlement. You've touched on the very sad possibility that this pandemic could undo 10 years of progress in eradicating global poverty, and we could see a resurgence of that scourge and food insecurity. How about climate? To what extent is this pandemic a trial run, if you will, for how states and non-state actors and agencies will respond to something on the scope of the climate crisis?
I think it underscores that without effective mechanisms for collectively solving our problems, that we won't solve them. And that we live on an ever smaller, more connected planet. So the imperative is we absolutely need to refurbish, reimagine all the ways that we can come together to create new solutions. And I do feel like in a lot of conversations that I've seen and heard, and I'm sure many of you, is that the pandemic is creating that bit of that pause button where you're able to rethink about, so what are the really urgent and critical issues? And there's a relationship as well to the constant louder thud of and more damaging sweep of natural disasters that are related to climate change. The pandemic is, arguably the result of lost habitat as we look at more and more diseases jumping from wild animals to humans, and this increase of zoonotic disease transmission. So we absolutely need to find more robust ways of solving our problems. It's absolutely a trial run.
Great. This is a wonderful conversation with Nancy Lindborg, President and CEO of the United States Institute of Peace. We have about 10 minutes left in the program and still plenty of questions, both via Zoom and YouTube channels. And I may start to combine a few, but here's an individual question from Ursuline Foley. Has the US administration's handling of COVID impacted our ability to influence peace in other nations?
We're so early in this crisis. We're 3 months in. Someone reminded me the other day that, the 2 world wars were 4 years each. And, they spawned enormous change and innovation. So I don't think we know yet. Stay tuned. And I also believe that action happens powerfully, not just government to government, but between people and government and people and people. And so I truly believe, and my entire career has emphasized that individual action matters.
Excellent. Here is a question directly about USIP, which can help our audience understand the role of your organization. It's from Roger Hudson. He asks, what is the standing or role of USIP within the US government? For example, influencing US support and for participation in WHO, Global Fund Gavi, and other organizations? Or is it mainly about advising what Congress should or shouldn't do? Or is it advising political policymakers in the administration about your own initiatives?
So to repeat something you said at the top, Bill, we are a nonpartisan, rigorously nonpartisan, independent but national institute. So think Smithsonian kind of institution that is founded and funded by Congress, with a very distinct mission of working with partners around the world to prevent and resolve violent conflict. So it's within the framework of how do we prevent and resolve violent conflict that we work. We do work closely with our interagency government partners, but we also work very closely with civil society and faith leaders, women and youth, governments around the world. What I love about USIP and have found it to be really a unique institution, I use the word unique lightly or rarely, is that it really is at the center of a lot of disciplines. So it's at the center of defense thinking, diplomacy, development, academic research, and it's able to draw on the best of those ideas and illuminate one to the other, and then put those ideas into practice, directly in practice. We have offices in about 6 countries around the world and significant partnerships in another dozen. So it's very much about applying the best ideas for this kind of work. And the fragility conversation is an excellent example of that, of taking a decade of research and learning, turning it into recommendations that became legislation, and now cycling that back to practice.
Here's a question that is praiseworthy of the US healthcare system, and I wonder if you would care to comment. Thank goodness we're not totally government run in the USA yet, because if you look at socialist and perhaps communist countries around the world, their healthcare system seems to be doing worse, and they're not doing as good a job taking care of their citizens in this pandemic era. What's your view about that?
I am not a health expert, so I can't comment in detail, but I would say the following from having spent decades in crisis response. And that is what's most important, regardless of who the actor is, government or private sector, is that people have clarity on what their roles and responsibilities are. And what the United States has something called the emergency response plan that is very clear about who's responsible for what when responding to a natural disaster. And so when you have chaos is when you cannot possibly have a decent response. You need clarity on roles and responsibilities, and you need to have a common strategy. That's pretty much at the heart of the Global Fragility Act as well. If everybody is working, and by everyone I mean all the various international actors are working with their own theory of the change, you will have a cacophony and you will cancel each other out. So whether it's private sector healthcare system or a governmental healthcare system, because they each have their, and I'm not an expert, but they each have their pluses and minuses. Those are the two critical characteristics for an emergency response. Is that kind of clarity and shared strategy.
Great. A final question from the field, and then I will close with a question of my own to wrap up this wonderful program. Nancy, there's an anonymous viewer who says, I have concerns about saying this COVID crisis is an opportunity. It sounds like Nancy Pelosi and what she says. When you talk about third world countries not trusting government information, we don't just have this problem here in the US today. And then on this topic of catalysts for solving conflict, can the pandemic be useful, for example, in a situation when warring factions begin to see a common enemy like the virus? Are we seeing such examples in the world today?
Well, first of all, seeing opportunity in crisis is a time-honored perception. As I said in my talk, the crises shake up hardened patterns, and you begin to see new ways that you could solve a problem that it's difficult to see in the status quo. So any crisis presents us with opportunities to think differently, to reimagine the way forward. I do believe that is the case for this as well. It has to be the case because we know that there is a need to think differently about some of the core problems that face us, and disruption provides that chance. What was the second part of the question?
Well, to what extent the pandemic can also serve as a catalyst for solving conflict? So it's yeah.
Right. So I mentioned the book that USIP published in 2011 called Pandemics and Peace by William Long, which explicitly looked at case studies where that happened. I personally experienced the instance of Aceh, a region in conflict with the rest of Indonesia, and that conflict was solved after the Indian Ocean tsunami. There have been some ceasefires. There's a humanitarian ceasefire going on right now in Afghanistan. I think it remains to be seen if we'll see any real and lasting peace emerge from this pandemic. But it's certainly, historically, there have been opportunities and there could be more opportunities. But I do think it will take the concerted focus and interest and pressure of the United States and the international community to help peace emerge from this pandemic.
Nancy, to close, one of the just fantastic things that has come from the partnership that World Affairs Councils around the country have had with USIP, and specifically on our Academic WorldQuest competition, is the category that USIP and preventing and reconciling conflict in the world has had for young people. I think when you and your senior leadership have also traveled to councils to make public remarks like this, you also serve as a mentor in some ways for the younger audience, and you have a stellar career path that they can benefit from. Now, you announced earlier this year that in January that you would be stepping down after your 5.5 years at USIP, and you will be assuming the role of president and CEO of the David and Lucille Packard Foundation back in San Francisco, near where you went to school so many years ago. Not that many years ago, maybe.
Lots of years ago.
But I wonder, you know, as you prepare for this momentous move, what you see as your legacy at USIP, what is in place for your successor to take it through this crisis and beyond, and what you're looking to do at the Packard Foundation.
Well, in terms of USIP, you know, it has been an extraordinary honor to lead that institution. It is filled with such amazing people, and I have learned enormously from all of them. I think my hope is that my legacy is that I was able to shepherd USIP through a time of its history that was somewhat chaotic to really ensure that it is an enduring institution. I think it's a very important part of the US government's panoply of tools. It's part of the national security architecture, but importantly, very much an expression of the American commitment to peace. And so I really have thought of my role there as enabling and unleashing the creativity of a deeply talented team. And my legacy will be held true as I look into the future. And I look forward to seeing what everybody continues to do. In terms of moving back to California and joining the Packard Foundation, you know, one of the things I look forward to is I started my career working on local issues. And for the last 30 years, I've worked internationally. With, you know, not to get too wonky, but the passage of the Sustainable Development Goals, which I hope many of you who are listening are aware of, one of the things I was really taken by the Sustainable Development Goals is that they weren't something that was happening over there in the less developed world, but it was really based on the understanding that this planet requires all of us working together and that the goals apply to all of us. And so I'm looking forward to returning to work that has more of a domestic local dimension, and returning to understanding how here in the United States we have some of these issues that we need to address.
We're seeing the same thing at the World Affairs Councils of America, and our individual member councils around the country are certainly focusing more and more on domestic issues as well as they telework and get through this crisis together. Nancy, your career has been stellar, as I mentioned, in not only the development space, diplomacy, humanitarian aspects, and I congratulate you on a great 5.5 years and look forward to working with your team, Anne-Louise Colgan and Allison Sturma, and your successor. It's been such a pleasure to have you so involved in our Academic WorldQuest and other programs at World Affairs Councils, and it's meant so much to me personally to know you and to interact with you over the years. Thank you very much for this program, and thank you for being with us throughout your tenure.
Bill, thank you. Again, we so value the partnership with the World Affairs Councils. I have treasured my visits to the councils around the country. And again, gratitude to everybody. The caliber of engagement, of discussion that I've encountered has been inspiring, and especially the WorldQuest. Not to pressure on the next generation, but they are absolutely critical for solving these problems and for bringing their vision, their voice, their innovation to really helping us, reimagine some of the solutions we need for the world ahead. And, the World Affairs Council has been terrific platform and incubator for that. So congratulations. It's been a true honor and pleasure to work with you and so many of your members.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the audience today for tuning in, especially the students. I promise we are going to have Academic WorldQuest next year. Next year for sure. If the pandemic is with us, it's going to be virtual, but I sure hope we can convene in person and visit USIP again for this wonderful competition. Thank you all for being with us. Study hard, engage actively, and be supportive of your local World Affairs Council and the United States Institute of Peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon, everybody.